Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to AJ 112 Introduction to Criminology. My name is Tony Farrar, and I am, of course, your instructor for this semester. Tonight's lecture is going to be on Chapter 4, and we will be covering rational choice theory. But along with that, a couple of other things. So, what is it that we're going to do tonight? Well, we're going to look at the development of rational choice theory, meaning how did it come about? We're going to explore the concepts of rational choice by looking at maybe some of the risks of crime and the structuring of criminality, etc. We're also going to look at a couple of instances and interpret whether or not there's enough evidence to show that some type of crime is rational. We will spend a little bit of time looking at situational crime prevention, which has subtopics in it of crime prevention strategies and also looking or evaluating some of those strategies. We're going to analyze the elements of general deterrence and then finally wrap it up with a discussion on the concepts of specific deterrence. So a couple more terms that are important for you to know. So with that being said, we're going to kind of jump right into our fact or fiction. This is the part where, again, I may answer some of these questions in the lecture, I may not, but the object here is to stimulate your brain and to get you going as we jump into tonight's lecture. So fact or fiction, neighborhood watch programs are a waste of time. So those programs that are out there where the community members attend and and sometimes they have food and sometimes they don't and this and that, but are they a waste of time? And then no, the second one, fact or fiction, living in a gated community decreases the risk of burglary. So think about those as we talk about some of these concepts of rational choice theory. But before we get started, a very quick case study. So in 2015, a Toledo, Ohio man by the name of Michael Weimer was sentenced to 27 years in prison after being convicted of charges relating to setting up a criminal enterprise that was designed specifically to steal trucks and strip them in his chop shop or disassemble them and then sell them as scrap metal. And 9 of his 13 co-conspirators, including his son and 2 brothers and 2 nephews, were also convicted in this particular case. And you can see the end result. The ringleader of this ended up getting 27 years. But his scheme to this whole thing was fairly complex. He and his fellow conspirators traveled outside of the Toledo area, including trips to Michigan and Indiana, to steal trucks so they could avoid detection by one single jurisdiction. So they would go somewhere else. And they would shop for semi-trucks at truck stops and other types of locations that were fairly close to the highways. So they kind of planned this out. And if they were traveling in Weimer's own truck, it would be a tractor minus the trailer. They would back up the truck to the trailer that they wanted, hook it up, and then take off. If traveling by car, one of the 2 thieves would break into an empty semi-truck with an attached trailer and hotwire the ignition, if you will, get it started, and then take the entire vehicle away. Now, this team preferred items that could be, chopped up into scrap metal. So they stole things like motorcycles, all-terrain vehicles, different metals and things like that. And by breaking into the trailers and taking a look, they could do this. Well, once back in Toledo with the stolen property, they would take the truck to one of his 2 chop shop locations where he had everything that he needed, from heavy moving equipment to floor jacks, blow torches, chainsaws, and all that kind of stuff like that. So you can see it was pretty sophisticated. But, at the end of the day, and he did have things like security cameras up to keep an eye on his shop and video footage could be monitored and things like that, but that was also used to convict him. So all of his evidence that was there was on film. So this case, why do I talk about it? Well, it does illustrate that the decision to commit crimes involves rational actions and planning and decision making. And in this case, designed to maximize profits and avoid detection. Rather than being unthinking and spontaneous, most crimes involve thought and planning that are designed to maximize the person's personal gain and, of course, avoid capture and punishment, because who really wants to get caught, right? I mean, kind of think about that. Now, some criminologists go as far as suggesting that the source of all criminal violations, even those like drug abuse, vandalism, and violence, etc., are a function of rational decision making. The decision to violate the law is made only after the offender carefully weighs out the benefits and the consequences of the action that they're going to do, and then decides that the benefits of the crime are greater than the consequences. And criminals may be motivated by a variety of different traits, emotions like greed, revenge, need, anger, lust, jealousy, thrill seeking, or vanity, etc. But regardless of the motive, and actually that's the need, but anyway, regardless of that, criminal offenders are people who make the decision to put their own needs ahead of the rest of us, even though there may be serious consequences for their action. Why? Well, because, after reviewing all of the available information, they believe that the rewards of the crime simply outweigh the risk. And this, in a nutshell, is the view of, or this view of crime causation is referred to as rational choice theory. The view that crime is a function of a decision-making process in which the potential offender weighs out the potential costs and benefits of an illegal act. And what I have here, and you don't have to watch these videos if you don't want to, but this is the Julia Murfeld case. It's 3 parts. The third part is actually at her sentencing hearing, but the first 2 show her involved in a conversation with an undercover officer plotting to have her husband killed. And in that, she does weigh some of the good and the bad and the ugly of this whole thing. So take a minute, if you want to, and watch the video, and then think about, was it spontaneous? Was it unthinking? Or was there really some thought and planning in this particular crime, in this Murfeld case, that was designed to maximize her personal gain and, because we don't want to forget this part, to avoid any type of capture or punishment? So, summary, some criminologists, again, go as far as suggesting that the source of all criminal violations, even those involving drug abuse and violence, they are, in fact, a function of this rational decision-making thing. Because there is, you look at the die right here, there's kind of a cost, benefit, risk type atmosphere in here, if you will. And the decision, again, to violate the law is made only after the offender kind of weighs out the potential benefits and consequences of whatever action that they're planning, and then decides that the benefits of the crime are greater than the consequences. And you may have done that early in life when you were growing up, even as a child, where you're going to do something wrong and you think about it. You might even do that as an adult. Hey, let me weigh the good and bad of this. And some of you might do that in a lot of different things. You might even have a checklist, or you might write it down and you're going to list on the left side the good stuff, and on the bad side, the bad stuff, or on the right side, the bad stuff, and ask yourself, well, which one is better for me. That's a function of this entire rational choice kind of theory, if you will. So, with that being said, how did it develop? Where did it come from? So, rational choice theory has its roots in the classical aspect of criminology developed by the Italian social thinker, if you will, Cesare Basiaria, whose utilitarian approach powerfully influenced the criminal justice system, and was widely accepted throughout Europe and the United States. And although the classical approach was influential for more than, let's say, 100 years, by the end of the 19th century, its popularity amongst criminologists declined a bit, and it was replaced for the most part by a positivist view that focused more on social and personal factors rather than this personal choice or decision making. The prevailing view was that crime was not a matter of choice, but more the byproduct of, let's say, destructive personal and social conditions and influences. Rather than controlling their behavior, people were at the mercy of their upbringing and their environment. So kind of some interesting thoughts as we look at this. Now, beginning in the late 1960s, criminologists once again began to embrace the classical ideas, producing books and monographs expounding on the theme that criminals are in fact rational actors who plan their crimes, who can be controlled by the fear of punishment, and who deserve to be penalized for their misdeeds. As a matter of fact, in the 1960s, Nobel Prize winning economist, okay, kind of interesting, not a criminologist, but an economist by the name of Gary Becker, applied his views on rational behavior and human capital, that which kind of translates to human competence or the consequences of investments, etc., to criminal activity. And Becker here argued that except for a few mentally ill individuals, criminals behave in a predictable or rational way when deciding to commit crime because they engage in a cost-benefit analysis. They weigh what they expect to be the gain against the risks that they must undergo and the costs they may incur, such as going to prison. So instead of regarding criminal activity as irrational behavior, Becker, this economist, viewed criminality as a rational behavior that might be controlled by increasing the costs of crime and reducing the potential for gain. So that's kind of an interesting concept in itself. Well, in a book called Thinking About Crime, political scientist James Q. Wilson observed that people who are likely to commit crime are unafraid of breaking the law because they value the excitement and the thrill of crime, and they have a low stake in conformity, and they are willing to take greater chances than the average person, and moreover, if they could be convicted, that their actions would bring severe punishment, only the total irrational would be willing to engage in these types of crime. Now, from these roots has evolved a more contemporary version of classical theory based on intelligent thought process and criminal decision making, and that today is referred to the rational choice approach to crime causation. But anyway, just kind of an example, and kind of an interesting thing. When you talk about concepts of rational choice and things like that, and the fact that some people choose crime and deviance because it provides excitement. Think about, if you can think back to January of 2014, pop singer, who was it, Justin Bieber, was arrested after drag racing in his Lamborghini, a super expensive car, by the way, while under the influence of alcohol, marijuana, and prescription drugs, and failing to cooperate when he was pulled over. And his arrest came about a week after his house in Los Angeles was searched by police following allegations that he had egged his neighbor's house and other things like that. Well, prosecutors dropped the drunk driving charge in an agreement that required him to get 12 hours of anger management and counseling and attend a program that teaches about the impact of drunk driving, etc. So, I mean, was that serious enough for him to consider not to do it again? And that's kind of one of the things in rational choice where you weigh what you're going to do against the outcome. And hopefully that kind of makes sense. So as we look at some of the concepts of rational choice, we'll get a little bit more information here. So according to contemporary rational choice theory, law violating behavior is in fact the product of careful thought and planning, and it assumes that people are self-interested, meaning interested in their own well-being and stuff like that, and will be willing to violate the law after considering both personal factors such as money, revenge, thrill, entertainment, etc., and situational factors like target availability or security measures or police presence. And it goes on to tell us that anyone is a potential criminal if they calculate that the profits are great and the risks are small. And with that being said, we'll go further into this and we'll look at some decisions made by potential criminals, and we'll kind of discuss them on some of the concepts that they're going to use. And I talked a little bit about JB, who's not my buddy, but I'll call him JB anyway, about his motivation, and whether what was his thought process when he did that. Did he think he was just too rich or famous and that he wouldn't get in trouble at all? Or, I mean, at the end of this, he really didn't get that much in the way of punishment either. So does that play into some of that? So some of the concepts of rational choice, some of the subheadings that we'll look at. One would be evaluating the risk of crime. So before deciding to commit crime, the reasoning criminal evaluates the risk of apprehension, the seriousness of expected punishment, and the potential value or benefit of the criminal enterprise, their ability to succeed, and the need for criminal gain. So people who believe that the risk of crime outweighs the reward, they may decide not to do it. So you can kind of say in this theory here that crime is avoided when the risk outweighs the reward. Now, when you look at this, let's look at burglary or burglars. Excuse me. Before deciding to commit crime, and this isn't a burglar, but I'll get to it in a minute, the reasoning person, so burglars when burglars go out and do this, they choose their targets based on their value, novelty, and resale potential, meaning the property that they're going to take. A piece of electronic gear that has not yet saturated the market and still remains at high value, like an iPhone, might be a prime target. And the decision to commit crime is enhanced by the promise of easy gain and low risk. In contrast, though, the decision to forego or not do the crime is reached when that potential criminal believes the risk outweigh the reward, meaning they stand a good chance of getting caught and punished. They fear the consequences of punishment, the risk of losing the respect of their peers or damaged reputation or feeling guilt or shame, or the risk of apprehension outweighs the profit or the pleasure of it. And we'll talk about risk evaluations, and they may cover a big range, a wide range of topics, like what are the chances of getting caught and how difficult will it be to commit that crime, and is the profit again worth the effort? And also, how familiar am I with the target? Am I going to be able to pull this off? So the photo in front of you is kind of the rational choice picture. Now, even though the little mouse has the helmet on to protect himself or herself, because I don't know the difference here, is it worth going for the cheese? And yeah, it's kind of a funny picture, but this is the essence of rational choice. Does the risk, even though he's got a little protection, does it outweigh him going through with trying to get the cheese? And I hope this is kind of making sense to you. So again, we talked about the burglar thing and the decision to commit the crime. If it's difficult to get into a garage to steal, if the garage is closed, it's harder. But if it's open, is it easier? And is it worth it based on some of those things that we talked about? So on the other hand, again, to not do the crime is reached when the criminal believes that risk outweighs the gain. And we looked at these 4 different concepts: a chance of getting caught, the fear of punishment, the loss of respect or reputation. So if you get caught and your name's in the paper or your picture's in the paper, or finally that risk of apprehension kind of outweighs whatever it is that you go for. So that's one, evaluating the risks of crime. Well, and another one, another consideration, I guess, to kind of think about is some individuals do it just for excitement. So people who decide to get involved in crime compare the chances of arrest with the subjective rewards of crime, if you will. And if the rewards are great and the risk is small and the excitement high, the likelihood of their committing the additional crime will increase. And some people do it just for simply the excitement. There are those that are out there. So with that being said, rational choice theorists view crime in a couple of different aspects, if you will. They view crime as both what we call offense specific and offender specific. And crime is said to be offense specific because offenders react selectively to the immediate characteristics of a specific criminal act. So take, for instance, the decision to commit a burglary. Offenders might consider things like the target, the yield, what they're going to get, security devices, police patrols, likelihood of arrest, the ease of getting in and out, or even selling the stolen property. Are the people home? Neighbors might see me. Are there guard dogs? When I get in, how do I get out? And point of entry and point of exit. So that's the offense specific. Now, offender specific is where crime is basically because criminals are, they're not robots or autonomous individuals who engage in unthinking and unplanned acts. At least that's what our theory says here. So before deciding to commit crime, the person has to decide whether they have the personal need, the skills, the prereqs, if you will, to commit a successful criminal act. And these might include some different things like, do I have the skills? If it's going into, can I crack the safe if you're a safe cracker? Do I have the skill to do that? The immediate need for money. Do I really have the need? Are there some alternatives? The availability of, let's say, alternatives. Are there resources to commit the crime I'm going to do? Fear of expected apprehension. Availability of alternative criminal acts. So instead of breaking into this house, maybe I can just sell dope instead. And then finally, and we can't forget about this, do I actually have the physical ability, like the health, the strength, or the dexterity to actually do this? So summarizing, going back, these are the offense-specific things that we would look at. And these would be the offender-specific type things that we would look at. Now, note the distinction, made here that we've kind of talked about between crime and criminality. A crime is an event. Criminality is a personal trait. Criminals do not commit crime all the time. Conversely, even the most honest citizens may on occasion violate the law. And some high risk people lacking opportunity may never commit a crime. Given enough provocation or opportunity, a low risk, law abiding person may commit a crime. So with that kind of being said, I think that we should take some time to look at, well, what are some factors then that structure criminality and structure crime? So it's important that we kind of look at these two different things. So remember, the crime is the event. Criminality is a personal trait. So as we separate these two, now let's discuss those factors that come into play that structure both criminality and crime. So the first one we'll look at will be peers and guardianship. Though young people are believed to be more crime prone than adults, effective monitoring by parents can reduce the likelihood of young people committing crimes. In contrast, of course, unsupervised activities will increase the risk. Kids are really more likely to choose crime when they are out at night without adult supervision, partying, drinking, and realistically hanging out with their buddies. The next one would be the need for excitement and thrill. Well, people may engage in illegal behavior because they like it. They love the excitement and the buzz that crime provides. And for some, crimes such as vandalism and shoplifting are alluring because they are stimulating and they allow you to get what sociologist Jack Katz states, the sneaky thrill. And profit really isn't the primary motive here. The need for excitement may counter even that fear for apprehension. So the riskier the act, the more attractive this particular thing becomes. The next one we'll look at will be economic need or opportunity. So clearly, one important decision that people make before they embark on a life of crime, if you will, is whether they really need the money or not. And the need to commit economic crimes diminishes, of course, when people are to obtain needed funds in a legitimate way, either by getting a job or government assistance or help from others or whatever. And other potential offenders simply may have money problems. They're in debt, their creditors are on them, and they have nowhere else to turn but to resort to some type of theft. Next, we'll talk about competence and experience. Personal experience and expertise may be an important element in structuring criminality, because remember, we're talking about structuring criminality here. Okay, and one reason is that the risk of detection, arrest, and punishment diminishes as burglars and auto thieves, etc., become better at what they do. Compared to unskilled beginners, experienced criminals profit more each time they commit a crime. They therefore can commit that crime or commit fewer crimes, leaving them less exposed for detection because they're successful in those few. While criminals may learn when to commit crimes, they also become aware of when to quit. So even those that are smart, no matter how successfully, a criminal's strength and emotional toughness eventually begin to kind of wane or reduce. And at that point, some get the message that maybe it's time to turn away from this risky behavior or criminal lifestyle um, to something a little bit less risky, if that's a good way of putting it. So competence and experience. What about structuring crime then? So we looked at the structuring criminality part, and now let's look at the structuring crime. So according to the rational choice approach, the decision to commit crime, regardless of its substance, is structured by, first, where it occurs, and second, the characteristics of the target. Okay, so let's kind of take a look at that. So, and even getting away. So we kind of want to throw that one in there when they talk about, choosing the places of crime, choosing the targets, and then getting away. These are all kind of important pieces. So choosing the place of crime. Well, criminals seem to carefully choose where they will commit their crime. I mean, drug dealers evaluate the desirability, if you will, of their sales area before they set up shop, and they may consider the middle of a long block the best choice because they can see everything in both directions and they can see the police coming, and criminals choose targets sometimes in familiar places where they know their way around and where they won't get like trapped or lost or something like that. Choosing targets, well, evidence of rational choice may also be found in the way that criminals locate their targets. Market forces can shape decision making. Targets that decline in value due to oversupply or people just don't use them anymore are unavoided. And materials such as metal parts and wire become, I don't know, coveted when undersupply causes their value to skyrocket. Robbers may seek targets with a great deal of cash on hands. Why bother to take someone's credit cards? You want some cash or something like that. Auto thieves are known to be selective in their choice of cars, often making their selection based on cash value and ease of sale. Burglars also seem to be particularly involved in rational choice when looking at their targets. Interviews with active burglars or people that have been arrested indicate that they check to make sure that no one is home before they go inside of a house. And some call ahead, some ring the doorbell, preparing to claim that they had the wrong address. Burglars sometimes seek unlocked doors to avoid the ones with deadbolts, or houses with dogs, or signs, or cameras. All of these different things fall into the choosing targets. And then finally, the last one here is getting away. Well, because criminals fear apprehension, professional criminals are going to really plan an escape route before they commit a crime. Having an effective exit strategy is just as important as planning the initial crime, if you will. Take the case of car thieves. Just in case they're caught, car thieves plan flight strategies in advance. They're ready for the high-speed chase, triggered by being asked to pull over. And some knew that police were forbidden to pursue speeding cars, making high-speed getaways that more effective. Or some knew how to get to their own neighborhoods so they could basically ditch their vehicle after being pursued and escape in some of the housing areas that they were familiar with that perhaps law enforcement was not. So in sum, meaning like in summary here, rational choice involves both shaping and structuring criminality and crime. Personality, age, status, risk, and opportunity seem to influence the decision to become a criminal. Place, target, and techniques help to structure crime. Now, before we get on to talking about whether is crime rational, let's look at, imagine you're a burglar, and what's your choice? Is your target rational? Well, if you see 3 Doberman pinschers, is this the right place for you? A lot of these homes have these Ring doorbells and things like that. So, again, the photos are just to kind of get you thinking, to understand this rational choice thing. Does the punishment outweigh the crime? Does the risk outweigh the reward, etc.? So now let's move into this discussion on, is crime really rational? So it's relatively easy to show that some crimes are in fact the product of rational, objective thought, especially when they involve an ongoing criminal conspiracy that's centered on some type of economic gain, like a chop shop or something like that. But when prominent bankers and financial analysts such as Bernie Madoff, if you remember that case, are indicted for criminal fraud, their elaborate schemes not only showed signs of rationality, but they also exhibited some really brilliant thought process. And even though it was flawed, it did have some expertise. But what about street crimes? Do these show elements of rational choice? Burglars, for example, we know they like to target residents close to maybe where they live and know the territory and have access to escape routes and blah, blah, blah. Street robbers are likely to choose victims who are vulnerable, have maybe they're smaller in stature, or they don't pose a threat, etc. They size up their prey, if that's a good way of saying it, and possibly get ready to use violence if the target appears to be streetwise. But what about some other types of street crime? So, think about it. Drug use. Is drug use rational? Well, did Oscar-winning actor Philip Seymour Hoffman make an objective, rational choice to OD on heroin? Again, kind of thinking about stuff like that. Did Prince choose to overdose on the opioid fentanyl? Did rising star Heath Ledger make a rational choice when he abused prescription drugs to the point that he died? Did British singer Amy Winehouse, did she choose to drink herself to death? Or did the king of pop, Michael Jackson, who died of acute benzodiazepine intoxication, was that a choice? And all of these are things for us to kind of look at. But research does show that on its onset, like kind of at the beginning, that drug use is controlled by rational decision makers. When you talk to users and stuff like that, they do report that they began taking drugs when they believe the benefit of this substance abuse would outweigh the cost. They believe that drugs would provide a fun, exciting, thrilling experience, and sometimes even friends and family also encouraged it. So kind of at the beginning, we see some rational choice. And drug dealers, they also, kind of an interesting thing, they approach their profession in a business-like fashion. Traffickers and dealers face many of the same problems that legitimate retailers do. If they're too successful in one spot, rivals might be attracted to the area, and the competition might drive down the prices. And the dealer can fight back against competitors by discounting the price of their drugs or increasing the qualities. And if these business tactics aren't working, dealers can always, turn to violence, which sometimes they do, where there's turf wars or drug wars. So again, we're not advocating this. We're saying that some of this is kind of rational choice thinking a little bit. Okay. Street level drug dealers also display rationality when they employ defensive measures to limit exposure to police. They have stash spots. Drug offenders are particularly attractive victims for robbery since they're typically stationary in public places. So all of this stuff around there, even online drug marketing, will use irrational means to escape detections, like fake identities and drop shipping and stuff like that. So, is the drug trade or is drug use rational? Well, maybe a little bit at the beginning. What about violence? Is that rational? Is it possible that violent acts are the product of seasoned decision making? I mean, what do you think about that? Again, it's easy to illustrate on some crimes, but is violence that way? Well, there is some evidence that confirms that violent criminals, even serial killers, select suitable targets by picking people who are vulnerable and lack adequate defenses. Street robbers use a considerable amount of rational thought before choosing a robbery, which may involve violence, over a burglary, which is more stealth and cunning, if you will. And robbers generally choose targets close to their homes or in areas where they routinely travel, and being familiar with the area gives them kind of ready knowledge, if you will, on escape routes. And, this is referred to as kind of their awareness space. And robbers may also be wary of people who are watching the community for signs of trouble. Robbery levels are relatively low in neighborhoods where residents keep a watchful eye for trouble and are quick to call law enforcement. So yes, there is some evidence that shows that even in violent crime, that there's some rationality for some of this type of stuff. What about hate crime? So again, we're looking at some kind of different crimes here. Can hate crime really be rational? Well, what do you think? It's hard to believe, but when Ryan King and Gretchen Sudo examined the characteristics of an outbreak of hate crimes, they found 3 factors that seem to trigger these events. An incident that leaves one group with a grievance against another, a definable target group held responsible for the deed, and publicity sufficient to make the event known to a broad public. All of these signs are kind of rational, wouldn't you say? Because they're kind of a calculated response, if you will. So hate crimes then are not merely the product of a disturbed mind, although they certainly can be, but sometimes they can be a rather calculated response to a concrete event whose impact is often fanned and inflamed by the media, of course. So, I mean, again, this is the theory. This is the theory of rational choice. So when you look at some of these things, is it rational? You can look at it and first and go, nah, they're just crazy, blah, blah, blah. But a lot of times there is some convincing evidence that shows that maybe it can fall under the rational choice theory, if you will. And then finally, what about a sex crime? Are men who solicit sex workers, Johns is what they call them, rational decision makers? And it kind of makes you think about this whole thing. Well, recent research by Thomas Holt and his colleagues found that not only do Johns make careful and rational decisions when engaging prostitutes, they shared their knowledge and expertise on the internet, in chat rooms and web forums. And topics there range from what kind of car to drive, to how to avoid police stops, to how to spot undercover police women posing as street workers, with some Johns suggesting that police women look more attractive and healthier than the average prostitute. And in addition to that, in addition to avoiding law enforcement, They shared information on how to protect themselves from becoming crime victims, because sometimes that happens, such as finding spots for their sexual encounters that minimize the likelihood of detection or violence. So yeah, so some of this stuff really is kind of rational when you look at it, and can fall underneath this rational choice theory. So in sum, okay, according to the rational choice approach, crime is not a random event, but the product of calculation and planning designed to provide the criminal with an overall benefit, whether it be monetary profit or an emotional thrill. To accept this rational choice view, you have to believe that criminals are in fact decision makers who spend time calculating profit and risk. They are selfish, self-absorbed people who care nothing about others, and if they believe that they can get away with the illegal or immoral behavior, then they're going to try. But what holds them back is fear from apprehension and punishment. Now, not everybody accepts this version of events, like criminologist Robert Agnew. He argues that the average person is just as likely to give consideration to others as they are to satisfy their own self-interest, and most people feel distress at the suffering of others and are inclined to pitch in and help in an emergency, even if it means taking a risk themselves. And Agnew suggests that though many individuals are self-interested, most of us are also socially concerned, a state of mind that provides a natural restraint against crime. So kind of an interesting thing. And if Agnew's view is accurate, then the image of the calculating criminal who weighs the costs and benefits without caring for other people is actually inaccurate. Now, rational choice theorists, just to sum this up, would disagree, of course, putting more stock into convincing would-be criminals that crime doesn't pay, rather than hoping that such people will empathize with their victim. Given that conclusion, rational choice advocates have formulated a number of potential strategies for controlling crime. Among the most significant are what we're going to talk about next, and that would be something called situational crime prevention. Figuring that there's still going to be, in the rational choice theory, that people still don't care, but what can we do to deter them? And that's where we're going to kind of go next. We're going to morph here, if you will, into this thing called situational crime prevention. So, well, what is it? Well, desperate people may contemplate crime, but only the truly irrational would attack what we're going to call now a well-defended, inaccessible target and risk punishment. Remember, risk versus reward. Law violators of all stripes, types, seek out targets that are attractive but yet vulnerable. That kind of makes sense. And criminals are ready and willing to pounce if A, there are valuable items, B, that can be taken easily because the victims don't take adequate precautions, if you will, without anyone around to protect them, etc. And that kind of makes sense too. So as we look at situational crime prevention, the acts, again, can be prevented if we actually put in a couple of different strategies. So it follows that crime prevention can be achieved by convincing this criminal that a particular target is not worth the effort. It's too hard. It's too hard of a nut to crack, to coin the phrase. And this particular approach is referred to as situational crime prevention. Because crime is rational and criminals calculating effective crime prevention strategies must be aimed at reducing immediate and particular criminal opportunities, making it more difficult to engage in successful criminal enterprises. And strategies such as target hardening that we're going to look at and improving surveillance are designed to do just that. So what are some of these strategies? So again, this crime prevention thing seeks to reduce the immediate and particular criminal opportunities. And criminal acts can be prevented if targets are guarded, are more hardened, if you will. The means to commit the crime are more controlled, and potential offenders are carefully monitored. So these are different strategies, and there's a phrase in there called dispensable space, and I want to kind of give you the definition. This is where you modify the physical environment to reduce the opportunity to have people commit crime. So an example of situational crime prevention, let's look at some of these things right here. When you look at this picture, what's wrong with this business? We've got all of those things in the windows, so you can't see in there. The office, police driving by can't see. People can't see if the clerk's being held up. So again, if you were to modify, what would you do? Lighting would be an important thing. Making sure there's enough lighting in areas that are dark. All of these are things that you can do. So here you would remove those. Here you've got some decent lighting that lights up the entire street, which makes it more difficult. If you were to compare, look at the dark, the left side with the right side, you can see the difference in lighting. And that light in itself might be a deterrent. There are some things like gates. When you talk about gating in a community and defensible space, it would still be really easy if you're looking at the right side of the screen for someone to hop up here and climb over. And again, this is all part of crime prevention. Could you use these trees to climb up inside here or to get over this wall right here? Is this really a good defensible space when somebody can climb right up here, get up here, jump up here, and then go in your upstairs window? So this is crime prevention when we look at it, okay? These are all different examples, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. I just want you to see kind of what it's like. So now that we know what that crime prevention, that situational crime prevention is, let's look at a couple strategies. The first, so situational crime prevention strategies involve developing tactics to reduce or eliminate a specific problem like shoplifting or something like that. And we divide them into about 6 different strategies. The first one, increase the effort needed to commit crime. Well, tactics to increase effort include target hardening techniques such as putting in unbreakable glass on storefront windows, or locking gates, or fencing yards. Okay, removing signs from store windows to increase visibility, like in the picture that I showed you. Next, increase the risk of committing crime. Well, if the risk of getting caught can be increased, rational offenders, which is what we're talking about, are less likely to commit a crime. Marcus Felsen argues that the risk of crime may be increased by improving the effectiveness of people who serve as guardians of the property. So, whether it's a rental property or whatever, are there more people around to watch and see? People that can call the police, etc. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. That's like crime discouragers, people who serve as guardians. Are there guards outside of the business, etc.? The next one, reduce the rewards of crime. Target reduction strategies are designed to reduce the value of crime to the criminal. So jewelry stores, display expensive rings with fake diamonds like cubic zirconia, etc., while keeping, let's say, the real diamonds under lock and key in the back. And sometimes just putting out a few things. So these are strategies that we can use to do that, to maybe alleviate, let's say, smash and grabs. Some retail establishments put small, valuable items in tamper-proof hard plastic cases and some of them have electronic signals to trigger alarms if something is taken out of the store. So that's another way to do that. The next one, induce guilt or shame. Crime may be reduced or prevented if we can communicate to people the wrongfulness of their behavior and how harmful it is to society. We can tell them say no to drugs, or users or losers or whatever phrase you have, but making people aware of the shamefulness of that, we hope to prevent that. Now, one of the big things that some states and cities have started to do is when you talk about issues of prostitution, if they make a bunch of arrests, they'll publish the person's photograph and name in the newspaper in order to shame them, possibly having, kind of guilt them, and then maybe that will reduce things in the future. Another one would be to reduce provocation. Some crimes are the result of extreme provocation, for example, road rage. Well, it might be possible to reduce provocation by creating programs that can reduce conflict. So again, just some ideas. And then last would be to remove excuses. Crimes may be reduced by making it difficult for people to excuse their criminal behavior by saying things like, well, I didn't know it was illegal, or I really had no choice. Some municipalities have set up roadside displays that electronically flash your speed. So that way you can't really say, hey, I didn't know how fast I was going, because it's like right in front of your face. Now that we've looked at some of those strategies, let's move into and talk about evaluating some of the situational crime prevention strategies. So situational crime prevention efforts bring with them certain hidden costs and benefits that can either undermine their success or actually increase their overall effectiveness. And what are these costs and benefits? And what do they tell us about the effectiveness and the efficiency of, let's say, crime prevention? So let's look at that. Let's look at some of the hidden benefits. The first one would be diffusion. And this is an effect that occurs when efforts to prevent one crime unintentionally prevent another one. And we're just going to kind of give you some definitions here. Discouragement, an effect that occurs when crime control efforts targeting a particular location help reduce crime in the surrounding area or populations. Displacement, an effect that occurs when crime control efforts simply move or redirect offenders to a less heavily guarded alternative target. Extinction, an effect that occurs when crime reduction programs produce a short-term positive effect, but the benefits dissipate as criminals adjust to the new conditions. And then replacement, an effect that occurs when criminals try new offenses they had previously avoided because situational crime prevention programs neutralized their actual crime of choice. So a couple of different benefits, and you can see both benefits and not good things that happen out of that. Now we're going to finish up. We're going to talk about deterrence. So deterrence, well, I wanted to show you a couple of interesting things first. According to rational choice view, because human beings are self-interested, rational, and reasoning, they will in fact violate the law if they don't fear the consequences of their crimes. After all, crime left unchecked can bring profit and pleasure. So it stands to reason then that crime can be controlled by increasing the real or perceived threat of criminal punishment. And this is the concept of what we call general deterrence. It's based on Bessaria's famous equation: the greater the severity, certainty, and speed of legal sanctions, the less inclined people would be to commit crime. Consequently, the lower the crime rate. So general deterrence then would be achieved if A, the police were effective in deterring crime and apprehending criminals, and B, judges and juries were sure to convict the guilty, who would then C, ensure harsh criminal punishments. Well, according to deterrence theory, not only does the actual chance of punishment, but two, does the perception of that punishment will almost certainly be forthcoming if they dare commit the crime. So a central theme of this deterrence theory is that people who believe or imagine that they're going to be punished for crimes in the future would avoid doing those crimes in the present. Does that make sense? So even the most committed offenders, gang members, terrorists, etc., might forego, not will, but might forego criminal activity if they really do fear legal punishment. Conversely, the likelihood of being arrested or imprisoned will have little effect on a criminal if they believe there's only a small chance that they're going to get punished, not caught, but simply punished. So because criminals are rational thinkers, they could be convinced that crime, could lead to punishment, then they would be deterred. But let's look at homicide just very quickly. I threw in a chart that shows, if you look at the red, it shows those states with death penalty, capital punishment, and then kind of the pink with the non-death penalty states. And one thing, and it's pretty accurate, I mean, it's up to 2016, so it's pretty recent. So if we're saying that you could receive capital punishment or the death penalty for murder, etc., certain capital cases, that should deter you. At least that's what we think. But if you notice, when you look at the red bars, the states with that are death penalty states, they have a higher murder rate. So just think about that as we talk about it. I mean, sometimes the square peg doesn't always fit in that round hole, if you will, okay? And we talked about the perception and deterrence thing. And I threw this in here only to talk just basically this photo about, drug dealing and stash houses and the perception of getting caught. This was a stash house. This is a narcotics team. They found all this marijuana, cocaine, heroin, etc. There was only one person in this particular house that was watching the house, and he was being paid quite a bit to sit and watch the drugs for this particular cartel, if you will. And, does the punishment outweigh the crime? He was paid a lot per day to stay in there, but if he got caught, then he was risking quite a bit of time in prison. So, with that being said, let's look at a couple terms that fall underneath this general deterrence, now that we kind of know what it is. So in some instances, deterrent strategies can lead to less than perfect results. We should figure that. And rather than entirely eliminating crime, they may only reduce its frequency, duration, and severity. So marginal deterrence refers to the relative effectiveness of punishments. Let's say when police are called to the scene of a domestic violence disturbance, they choose to arrest some offenders and let others go with a warning. If getting arrested reduces the chance of repeat offending when compared to a warning, arrest is said to produce a higher marginal deterrent effect. Does that make sense? And then restrictive deterrence, sometimes called partial deterrence, refers to situations in which the threat of punishment can reduce but not eliminate the frequency, severity, or duration of a crime. So hopefully you kind of got those two definitions down. So along with deterrence theory, we have to look at punishment and deterrence, because this is a part of this particular theory. So according to general deterrence theory, if the certainty, severity, and speed of the arrest, conviction, and sanctioning increase, then crime rates should really go down. Crime will persist, however, if people believe that they will get away with crime, and even if they're caught, they're only going to have they'll have a chance of escaping punishment, or the punishment will be very minimal. So certainty of punishment kind of comes into play. So a number of research efforts do show a direct relationship between crime rates and the certainty of punishment. And although the issue is far from settled, people who believe that they will in fact get caught if they commit a crime are the ones most likely to be deterred from committing these crimes. So again, certainty of punishment. Now, severity of punishment, according to deterrence theory, people who believe that they will be punished severely for a crime will forego committing criminal acts. Nonetheless, it really is little consensus that strict punishment alone can reduce criminal activities, and most criminologists believe that the certainty of punishment rather than severity is the key to deterring criminal behavior. And honestly, if you go back to the slide with this, we know the severity of punishment, but is it really decreasing? So you can kind of look and see how those play into, kind of they go into this deterrence theory. And then finally, under punishment and deterrence is swiftness. The third leg of Bessaria's equation here involves speed of punishment. The more rapidly punishment is applied and the more closely it is linked to the crime, the more likely it is to serve as a deterrent. So, again, the faster that that's going to take place, the more likely that's actually going to be a true statement. So with that said, real quick, how do we evaluate all this? Well, we have some when we talk about evaluating general deterrence, well, first we do it through rationality. Deterrence theory assumes a rational offender who weighs the costs and benefits of a criminal act before deciding to decide, a course of action. And criminals may be desperate people who choose crime because they believe there's no reasonable alternatives. So again, we talk about evaluating. Compulsion. Many offenders act compulsively and are therefore unlikely to be deterred from the threat of future punishment. System effectiveness, as Bessaria's famous quote tells us, the threat of punishment involves not only its severity, but also certainty and speed. And again, some offenders and some crimes are typically more deterrable than others. Not every crime can be discouraged, nor every criminal deterrable. Some people may be suffering from personality disorders or some type of mental defect, or kind of immune to this thing called deterrence. Now we're going to wrap up with two things. We're going to talk about specific deterrence and how this all plays in, and then we're going to be done. So the theory of specific deterrence, also called special or particular deterrence, holds that criminal sanctions should be so powerful that known criminals will never repeat their criminal acts. And according to this view, the drunk driver who sentences a substantial fine and a week in the county jail should be convinced that the price to be paid for drinking and driving is too great to consider future violations. And similarly, burglars who spend 5 years in a tough maximum security prison should find their enthusiasm for burglary kind of lessened. In principle, punishment works when a connection can be established between the planned action and memories of its consequences. If these recollections are adequately intense, the action then is unlikely to occur again. So the theory, supposes that people can basically learn from their mistakes, and that those who are caught and punished will perceive greater risk than those who have escaped detection. So specific deterrence, again, is the view that criminal sanctions should be so powerful that the offenders really won't repeat their criminal acts. And that's part of specific deterrence. Now, part of that deals with incapacitation. So even if severe punishment cannot effectively turn criminals away from crime, it stands to reason that more criminals are sent to prison, the crime rate should go down. Because most people age out of crime, the duration of a criminal career is in fact limited. Placing offenders behind bars during their prime crime years then should reduce their lifetime opportunity to commit crime. And the shorter the span of opportunity, the fewer offenses they commit during their lives, hence crime is reduced. It kind of makes sense. And this theory is basically called incapacitation theory. So, I'm going to go back to the slide here and talk about, is it possible that specific deterrence can be achieved if the severity of punishment is increased and the type of punishment is amplified? So, you can look through those and you can see that it is, but a lot of us fall into this thing called the incapacitation effect. The idea of keeping offenders in confinement, that's going to eliminate them from committing future offenses. And basically more than 1 in every 100 adults is behind bars. There have been periods of times where increases in incarceration rates, increased while overall crime was decreasing. Other times, crime rates have increased coinciding with increased incarceration rates. So it's not always going to be an exact science kind of here. The effect itself is using incapacitation strategy to control crime. It might work, but it's also going to bring some other unpleasant side effects. And we kind of know what some of the arguments, and there's not a lot of evidence that kind of supports that this effect is going to be, overridingly good, where it's going to work all of those times. Okay, so I know I moved through it kind of quickly, and I gave you a chart here as well that talks about rational choice, the major premise, the strength, and the focus. Same with deterrence, same with specific deterrence, and then finally incapacitation. So we're going to end with this this rational choice theory in criminal justice. So from the origins of classical theory to the development of this modern rational choice view, the belief that criminals choose to commit crime has influenced the relationships among law, punishment, and crime. And although research on the core principles of choice theory and deterrence theories has produced mixed results, these models have had an important impact on the criminal justice system crime prevention strategies. And we know while adding more cops seems a logical way of deterring crime, this assumption really has kind of been in question. There was a study that was done called the Kansas City Patrol Study that found that crime rates were basically unaffected by merely increasing or decreasing the number of police on patrol. Nonetheless, some recent evidence indicates that adding police patrol forces does in fact help reduce crime rates, and that police are a more effective deterrent than toughening sentencing laws or even putting people in prisons. And then there are things like the 3 strikes law. There's a lot of public outcry on things like this. So again, different theories of rational choice that focuses in here. And to kind of finish up, the fact that punishment may deter criminals from committing crime has shaped sentencing policy. A number of states have adopted some draconian sentencing policies that require mandatory prison terms for specific crimes like drug trafficking or the use of a firearm while committing crime. Another deterrent strategy is 3 strikes, like I talked about, which require state courts to hand down mandatory periods of incarceration of up to life in prison for people who have been convicted of serious criminal offenses on 3 or more separate occasions. And while a policy of placing people convicted of a third felony behind bars for life is politically compelling, and some of you might agree with it. Many criminologists believe that these laws are a little bit ineffective and are going to create a growing population in our prisons, which is going to be super expensive. And we already know that in California because we have early prisoner release. So, a lot of stuff to cover. That's going to conclude our chapter 4, talking about rational choice theory and deterrence theory. Please take the time to look at the key terms at the end of the chapter, and also look through the critical thinking questions to kind of activate your brain. And with that being said, that's going to be the end of our lecture for chapter 4, and until next time.